Okay, Jacqueline, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much.
First thing I'd like to ask you is to just briefly introduce yourself.
My name is Jackie Coyle-Shapiro. I've been at the LSE for about 20 years. I'm currently chair of the OB division. My research is in the employee-organisation relationship.
Which is also the topic of our interview. You specifically, I guess, have done a lot of research on the psychological contract. So if you can just say briefly what that is and why it matters.
The psychological contract captures what an employee believes the employer has promised to give them and what they need to do in return. So I've done a lot of research looking at the consequences of when an employee experiences breach, how they react to that, or how an employee reacts when they experience fulfillment. So with Neil Conway, we found that psychological contract fulfillment leads to higher performance in terms of sales, and psychological contract breach leads to a reduced performance, but also employees become less likely to engage in citizenship behavior, staying late, doing extra things for the organization.
Could you give examples of what is it actually that is promised or then maybe not delivered? I mean, what would be content really that are part of this?
Sure. Organizations can promise things like promotion. So organizations may say employees who excel in this organization within a couple of years get promoted. And so when the employee joins the organization, they're thinking a couple of years they will see their promotion, and that doesn't materialize. So an employee might experience that as a broken promise. In terms of training and development or the type of support, particularly at interviews, organizations may make promises in terms of what an employee will get if they come to work at a particular organization.
Can it actually happen the other way around also? I mean, the employees, like for instance, in those interviews at the start, they make all sorts of promises potentially also. So have you looked at that side of the story also?
Yes. What we found is that employees who experience, or employers who experience employees breaching their psychological contract, what we know is that they get lower performance evaluations. Beyond that, there hasn't been a lot of work that looks at how supervisors and managers react when an employee doesn't fulfill their promises to the organization.
Okay. You talked about one content specifically, promotions and training and development. There have been these terms of the relational contract and the transactional contract, and also the ideological contract. What are those things, and makes it a difference what kind of contract I actually have?
So transactional psychological contract is about the tangible economic exchange. So pay, fringe benefits, pensions, etc. Relational psychological contract is capturing the more socio-emotional elements, thinking about the relationship over a long period of time. So there you've got job security, loyalty, career development. Ideological currency is looking at how the organization provides an opportunity for an employee to contribute to a social cause, or a cause that the organization feels quite strongly about, whether it be environmental issues, alleviating poverty. Many organizations identify a particular cause.
Okay, have you looked at differences? I mean, depending on what the content actually is. I mean, having a transactional contract fulfilled versus breached, versus having an ideologically based contract fulfilled or breached?
There hasn't been a lot of research that looks at how the different psychological contracts or dimensions of the psychological contract operate. There is a little bit of research by Bingham that looks at how transactional, relational, and ideological have a differential effect on outcomes. But I think we need more research that looks at the interactions between the different components of the psychological contract, so that if the organization isn't in a position to give me what was promised, I can still maintain the relationship because it's allowing me to contribute to a cause, whether it's educating blind children or whatever the cause of the organization is following.
When you say organization, who is that in the end? I mean, who is that side of the contract actually? So when I, as an employee, want to make sure that this is working out, who's my partner in this?
I think that that's a difficult issue, primarily because there are a number of organizational agents. And employees, first line supervisors important, HR plays a role, senior management play a role. So all those influences come together so that when an employee, when you ask an employee about the organization, they think about the actions of organizational representatives.
When I, as an employee, want to make sure, in as much as I can, that this psychological contract is working out, who should I address? I mean, what would be your advice to people on that?
I think if they have an open and supportive relationship with their line manager, I think that's fundamentally important in terms of discussing misinterpretations, broken promises. Performance appraisal time is also a good opportunity to raise those types of issues. But if the employee has a high quality relationship with their first line manager, then that's clearly the first port of call to try and understand whether the broken promise was due to misinterpretation, miscommunication, misunderstanding, or whether the supervisor can actually give a credible justification for why someone didn't actually get the promotion or didn't get the pay raise.
Okay. You've done research on this in the UK, but also in Tunisia, in India, maybe even in other places. Does it matter where it actually happens? Is the dynamics the same everywhere? What are differences?
What's very interesting is that universally there's a negative reaction to contract breach. So it doesn't matter whether the sample's in Singapore, Pakistan, Australia, Switzerland, the UK, it really doesn't matter. People respond negatively to broken promises. What I think is interesting is that culture comes into it in terms of how negatively they respond. So there's a negative response, and what we find is that collectivist cultures, cultures that are high on power distance, are going to react less negatively. They still react negatively, but it's going to be less negatively than in other cultures such as the US, the UK, and European countries.
Do you find that, again, the content of what is exchanged in this social exchange between employer and employee, is that different in different countries, and therefore then breach of different contents is more or less relevant?
I think that it's going to be different in different organizations. So you're going to get a lot of differences within one culture depending upon the type of organization that an employee is in. And so I would say that there's probably more intra-country variation than there is across countries.
So organizations would be the more important part. How about occupations? I mean, does that make a difference?
I think, of course, it does. I think that it really depends on, if we take the public sector, non-public sector divide in terms of, whether you're a nurse working for a publicly funded hospital, then I think you're going to pick up on differences in terms of occupation. A consultant is going to have a very different psychological contract to a firefighter. And so there are going to be occupational differences across a range of occupations. And then it's going to be more pronounced if you look at some of the more manual occupations. So you could get very, very different psychological contracts across occupations.
Okay. You've started work in India, in this teachers teaching kids in slums as part of this research of psychological contract. Can you say a little bit about why you started doing that and where that is to go?
Well, I started, we were just at the beginning, started through a conversation with a colleague where I was discussing ideological currency, and essentially through that conversation I was able to look at some qualitative data that had already been gathered, looking at it through an ideological currency lens, looking at how slum school teachers who are living in extreme poverty, how they see the relationship with their school. And so the work is ongoing, and hopefully will shed more light on this notion of why, how, when ideological currency matters in the relationship between an employee and the organization.
Thank you very much. All the best with all that work, which I think is very important. Thank you again.
Thank you.